Big Seance Podcast, episode 126.
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
So I decided that we were going to take a little field trip on this episode of the Big Seance Podcast. And we would come to my loft, actually, where I keep all of my books, my library. And I didn't have, an interview for this week, and school has kind of kept me focused on that part of my life. And for a while now, I've thought about doing some kind of episode like this. A while back, I posted my list of every book that I've ever read, which is something that I've done for, I'd want to say, like 12 years. And the reason why I started doing that is, I think I've probably mentioned it before, I was not a big fan of reading growing up. I hated it, actually. Only read when I absolutely had to, and even sometimes then I did not. But an ex of mine at the time, around 12 years ago or more, suggested that I read this book. That was the first book in a series, which was Tales of the City. Yeah. Well, let me look. It's right here. Yeah, Tales of the City. And the author is Armistead Maupin. And let's see, I'm counting the books right now because I'm right here. Right now it's a 9-book series. And it started in the 70s. And the most recent book came out, I want to say 5 years ago. And it totally caught my attention. And I loved it. And I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just the content of that book. And again, it's fiction. But I was totally into it. And starting with that first book, I ended up reading about 1 book a week for a whole year. Mostly fiction at that time. And I was so incredibly excited and proud that I was finally reading and loving it. And so I started documenting every book. That kind of also started my obsession of the shelving ceremony and the whole idea that I got excited to watch the shelf grow and having to get another shelf. I remember having to go to the furniture place or to the store, wherever I went, and go, wow, I need a bookshelf. And that was exciting. And, cut to just 3 years ago when Joe and I moved to our home now, and this loft had 5 giant bookshelves just already kind of built into the loft. And I was like, those are my bookshelves and those need to stay here. And they did. And I loved them. So I'd say for about a year, it was mostly fiction that I read. And after that, Ghosts Among Us by James Van Praagh. And I've mentioned that in several episodes. Then I kind of gradually shifted to only nonfiction. And at this point, if I ever read fiction, it's a struggle for me because I kind of feel like I'm wasting my time. I feel like I'm not learning. And not everything soaks in my brain the same way, but I kind of feel like I have to be learning and moving forward in this, spiritual growth type of thing. And so all my nonfiction books tend to be paranormal, spiritual, from psychics and mediums, paranormal researchers and investigators, sometimes scientists. And, yeah. And the organization of my library. Merrill decided he's going to join me. Hey, we're on a field trip. What do you think, buddy? He's sitting here just staring at the bookshelves with me. I have one shelf of fiction, actually 2 shelves of fiction that I've read. And then I have a section of 2 shelves that are predominantly like spiritual / psychics and mediums. Then I have 2 shelves that tend to be more, I don't know. Sometimes there's not really a clear choice of which shelf they go to. But sometimes these 2 shelves end up being more kind of scientific, paranormal investigation, research, that type of thing, but not always. I organize them by shape for sure. So, you know, I'm kind of an OCD person, at least visually. And so from left to right, you know, the books go from tallest to shortest. And sometimes it's hard to balance the hardcovers with the paperback covers with that. I know some of you understand what I'm saying with that. And otherwise, there's not really any organization. I guess sometimes I eyeball it, but there's not really a chronological order or alphabetical order. And I don't really use Dewey Decimal for sure. Maybe I should. Maybe one of these days I'll end up having to do that. But then I have a rather backed up, you know, to be read shelf that has a whole variety of books. There's some fiction on there that people have recommended or sent to me. There's some music titles even, some nerdy Broadway titles, but a lot of books that I'm excited to read in the paranormal spiritual genre that I'm going to get to one of these days. But that tends to grow faster than the rate of speed that I read. I also have a shelf of Halloween books. Got about 6 or 7 of them. I wish there were more of those out there. Love those. If you ever see a new Halloween book, like with history and sometimes crafting, like Halloween crafting and ideas, I'd love to know about it. Let me know, because those fascinate me. And I love to read those in September and October. And on that same shelf, I have books specific to Missouri. And, well, I guess not necessarily Missouri, but local areas like, there's some Illinois and Missouri or St. Louis. And so I keep those specific titles there. And then I have a shelf of just kind of reference books. Rosemary Ellen Guiley, for example, has several books that are enormous. And rather than, read them through, they're just kind of there for reference. And I refer to them if I ever need to, or if I'm preparing for something or researching for something. So I have a number of books there that are not necessarily read. And, my OCD brain wants to separate them from the books that I've read, because I don't want to lie and say I've read them, because I haven't, but they're there for reference. Then I have, I have the Bibles, the dictionaries. Even it goes back to a book giant book of Bible stories that I know probably several of you have seen, that I think was my mom's growing up and was handed down to me when I was growing up. And, it's just one of those things you have, and it's there. There's also some yearbooks. I have a whole bunch of yearbooks that I collect from my hometown. And then, of course, the school where I teach, I'm quickly collecting a yearbook for every year that I've been there. And I love them. I love seeing them grow too. And I go to them every now and then if I see a face a former student, and I'm like, what's that kid's name? I'll go through a few of those yearbooks until I find my answer. And then I feel bad for forgetting their name. Then, of course, Joe has his books, and we have some just kind of random things that don't really fit in a section, and I've never read, but cool to have. And, of course, with a lot of tchotchkes and set-abouts all around. So that's the bookshelf. Let's chat about a few of these. I think we'll go back to the parlor for that so I can organize my thoughts. So now I'm back in the parlor, and I've come up with a whopping list of 20 books that I'm going to recommend for you today. And I want to point out that even though I've featured a lot of awesome authors who have promoted great books in the past, I've kind of on purpose avoided them because, first of all, it's kind of like choosing and promoting your favorite child. Plus, you can go to those episodes for information on those books. But with that being said, you will hear me mention, I think, 2 books that have been featured by the authors at some point here on the podcast. And to the best of my ability, I'm going to link you to each book on Amazon if they're available. And if podcast episodes are mentioned, I'll link those as well. I know you're waiting to hear the tea being poured, so here we go. Let's crack open some books. Ghosts Among Us, Uncovering the Truth About the Other Side by James Van Praagh. I look back and realize that this book probably isn't any more mind-blowing than many of the other books that I've read since. But as I've mentioned in many previous episodes, Ghosts Among Us was really the book that started an obsession for finding answers, and it was the beginnings of what you've heard me refer to as my spiritual shift. I loaned the book to my mother, who loved it as well. I've since loaned it to a few other people, and when I didn't get it returned, I went out and replaced it just to put it on my shelf again. Life on the Other Side, A Psychic's Tour of the Afterlife by Sylvia Browne. I don't know what it is about Sylvia Browne that makes her so polarizing to some people, and I have my own little skeptic flags, I guess, that pop up with some of the predictions or statements that she's made. But I'm here to tell you, she wrote good books. I haven't read all of them, but I've read many, and they always suck me in. If you need one Sylvia Browne book to read, just to try to see if you like Sylvia, then grab this one. Her description of the afterlife, what it looks like, what you'll do, what the temperature will be even, she'll tell you in fine detail. It is fascinating. So that's Life on the Other Side by Sylvia Browne. The Ghost Hunter's Survival Guide, Protection Techniques for Encounters with the Paranormal by Michelle Belanger. Most of the time when I was doing investigating and helping folks when I could, individuals would call or write to me with paranormal concerns. And they wouldn't so much be interested in an investigation immediately. They probably felt a little silly for calling, and they just wanted to be heard, I think, most times, and get some feedback and maybe some suggestions or answers. On many occasions, I just encouraged people to get this book. I can't say I've tried all the techniques that are covered, and I also wouldn't feel capable or, I wouldn't feel like the expert I needed to be to conduct some of them, but you never know what you may need to be prepared for in paranormal situations. And some people may feel comfortable adopting some of the practices on a routine basis. Don't let the title deceive you, though. This book could be useful for anyone, whether you ghost hunt for fun or are more serious. Michelle teaches you how to clear yourself after you leave haunted locations to avoid hitchhikers, for example, But there's also good basic advice on how to sage or cleanse a home. Michelle Belanger has many books on several topics, but I've been known to bug her about when another great book like this one will come out, and I'd love to have her on the podcast sometime. True Haunting by Edwin F. Becker. True Haunting is the true story of the incredible experiences that Edwin and his young family experienced in Chicago in 1970. In a time before there were thousands of paranormal groups and ghost hunters on TV, this family had to make quite a few brave decisions to survive. It ended up being the first haunting and exorcism to be reported on and covered on the news. You can find that news footage in an old blog post at bigseance.com. How often have you or anyone you know asked any of these questions? Can a ghost move an object? Do they hear us? Can they hurt us? Could they be demonic? Should we be giving them attention? Is it okay to show them off? Can we get rid of them? And should we move? Most of these questions are still being asked today, and the paranormal field has come a long way since 1970. Or has it? For sure, finding access to information, the ability to find and communicate with people having similar experiences, and finding help is a lot easier to accomplish today. But there are still individuals and families out there going through similar experiences. After you read this book, I recommend checking out the episode of Syfy's Paranormal Witness from several years back, where the Becker's story was featured. I also had the opportunity to interview Edwin in 2 parts in 2014, and I'll have all of this linked in the show notes. True Haunting very much reminded me of a book called Grave's End, a true ghost story by Elaine, Mercado. This is a similar book to the True Haunting book in that they were both publicized real hauntings that you may not have heard about, and they were written by members of the families who experienced extremely frightening paranormal events firsthand. The family in Gravesend had their home visited by the famous parapsychologist Dr. Hans Holzer in the early 1980s. Both Ed Becker's True Haunting and Gravesend read like fiction and are hard to put down. House of Spirits and Whispers by Annie Wilder. One of my favorite lighthearted nonfiction reads about ghosts is House of Spirits and Whispers. I really, truly could not put this book down once I started it. Annie details how she came upon her old Victorian home in Hastings, Minnesota, and the spirits she was unaware came with it. She is so detailed, she even includes floor plans. Floor plans. Retiring in an old, beautiful Victorian home is something I've always kind of wanted to do. By the end of the book, I was so jealous that I didn't own her house, and I wanted to make a visit. She's invited me, by the way. That's very kind of her. From the back of the book cover, it says, in 1994, Annie Wilder and her children moved into a 100-year-old house in a historic Mississippi River town. Beautiful but spooky, the house had been on the market for 6 months with no offers. It felt like, and proved to be, a very haunted house. Essentially the story of a remarkable old Victorian house that seems to be a threshold to the spirit world and the astral realm. House of Spirits and Whispers has a backstory of the Wilder family's relationship with the ghost of the home's previous owner, an old man named Leon. Covering a decade's worth of ghostly activity and supernatural events, from whispering radiators to visits and appearances from all manner of spirits and entities, this unusual story is the true account of Annie Wilder's experiences living in a haunted house. There's a cool video out there on YouTube where Annie has a segment on the biography channel's My Ghost Story Season 2, Episode 3. She was also, I think, the 3rd episode of the Big Seance podcast a long time ago. And you could get to that by going to bigseance.com/3. which sounds weird, but there you go. Voices of Eternity by Sarah Wilson Estep. This is the book that inspired me to conduct a serious 2-week daily EVP experiment in my home in 2012. Sarah Estep started her journey of EVP in 1976 with the intention of recording for just 1 week at first. Her loved ones thought she was crazy too. If she didn't hear any voices by the 7th day, she wouldn't continue. I found some reassuring inspiration from Sarah in the last few chapters of the book, and I had just completed my 4th consecutive day of recording when I finished her book. Here's the passage. Since many experimenters work for weeks before picking up their first word, I was fortunate to record beauty on the 6th day. Even with this, it was far from easy. I would go for days and not hear a thing, and then, when I was feeling most discouraged, someone would come through and say, "Don't give up." I think this is one of the secrets of voice recordings. If you don't give up, if you persevere, you will receive answers. The voices will speak to those who search, but it is up to each person to initiate that search. As she mentioned above, hearing the word beauty on the 6th day was enough to keep her pushing forward and was the beginning of many years of successful EVP research. You may find it interesting to learn that I didn't capture anything impressive during the exhausting 2-week experiment until the very last day. And that last session just happened to be my first of several visits from who regular listeners will know as my rapper. It paid to have patience and use Sarah as inspiration. Sarah Estep would later become known as one of the modern pioneers of EVP. She formed and ran the American Association of EVP, or AAEVP, which has since been renamed and is the Association Transcommunication, or ATRANS-C. Sarah Estep died in 2008. Here's another passage from the book that really felt good for me to read. I am willing to accept whatever conditions our communicants set, for I know that eventually we will be able to find our way firmly, without hesitation or faltering, to the other side. Crossing the bridge is available not only to our friends in other realms, but to those of us who wish to make the journey. That they want this to be a mutual crossing there can no longer be any doubt of. If they hadn't meant for our worlds to meet, they would not have begun to speak 30 years ago. Now, she's going to talk about, I think, either a spirit she regularly got EVPs from, or it could be a guide, and I don't remember, honestly. She says, recently I asked Sty why he and his friends sought to contact us on the Earth plane. His female associate first answered, help them. 2 counters later, Sty agreed, clearly giving the same message, help them. In the following recording, he replied, it is, when I asked whether it was accurate to think that they wanted to help us so we would know what to expect when we crossed over to the spirit world. Many months ago, when I was working on the 3rd chapter, The Voices on Death and Dying, a clear voice said, your soul is not defeated. They knew I was writing about death, and they took this additional way to reassure me, to reassure everyone that life does not end at the grave. Life is eternal. So those were words from Sarah Estep. If you'd like to hear some of Sarah Estep's EVPs, you can visit the World ITC website. You also should know that thanks to the Association Transcommunication, Voices of Eternity is available for free in its entirety online via a PDF download at atransc.org. There is no death and there are no dead by Tom and Lisa Butler. Tom and Lisa Butler are the researchers who took over the American Association for EVP when Sarah Estep retired, and they're the ones who rebranded the organization as ATRANS-C. Here's something from the A-Trans-C site. When the Butlers assumed leadership of the AAEVP in 2000, now Association Transcommunication, they realized there was a need for a text which they could refer people to as a dependable source of information about EVP and other forms of ITC. This book is the result and remains today an important introduction to these phenomena. And here's the description from the back of the book. Many may be shocked to learn that the so-called dead have been communicating across the veil through electronic devices since the early 1900s. More than anecdotal evidence exists that we survive physical death and that our loved ones on the other side continue to communicate with us. Indeed, objective evidence collected from electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, and video instrumental transcommunication, or ITC, reveals that they actively seek ways to contact us and to offer guidance to experimenters on improving these communications. Obtaining paranormal voices is not difficult and is achieved both by not only respected scientists and investigators, but by anyone following a few simple steps with equipment most already have. This book includes simple instructions for experimentation and explores the body of EVP and other evidence already accumulated by researchers around the world. There are also instructions for experimenting with video ITC. I'm Still Here by Martha Copeland. If you are a parent who has lost a child, or anyone who has lost a loved one, you absolutely should watch 2 videos that I've shared many times in social media, and I blogged about them years ago. They're videos about a group called The Big Circle, which grew out of the Association Transcommunication after Tom and Lisa Butler took the reins. As you'll read in the book and see in the videos, Martha Copeland started The Big Circle after her teenage daughter, Kathy, died in a car accident. From the other side, Kathy began communicating with loved ones via the computer and EVP. The last paragraph of I'm Still Here really moved me, and this is that portion of the book. After completing this last page of the book, I envisioned a white light of love and protection surrounding me. Turning on my recorder, I posed this question. Kathy, how do you and the Big Circle feel about the book? Playing back the recording, I could hear Kathy's voice saying, "Thank you, Mom," and a male voice followed her voice with a clear thank you. Come on, man. How can anybody not be moved by this stuff? I'm not sure, honestly, if the Big Circle is still active or who is running it, but years ago they described themselves in this way, and this was from the website at that time. The Big Circle consists of our loved ones in the etheric, along with their loved ones in the physical. The realization that this group existed in the etheric and was trying to connect to their loved ones here in the physical world prompted members of the association to form a special group called Big Circle Bridge to the Afterlife, which is now referred to simply as the Big Circle. This group is made up of bereaved parents, spouses, siblings, and friends whose mission is to build a channel between the physical and etheric aspects of reality, a bridge to the afterlife. We effectively conduct a worldwide group recording session. Some participants join together in groups or individually from their homes, making a joint effort to record for about 5 minutes. And again, that's probably a couple of years old. That's just the information that I had on there before. But really, I'm serious. Whether you read the book or check out the 2 videos, they are amazing. I could watch them again tonight. I've seen them so many times. Know Yourself, a new technique for developing your psychic and spiritual awareness by Patricia Hayes. Know Yourself is out of print and very hard to find, but it's almost written as if it's a text for a course on psychic development. Patricia Hayes, collaborated and learned from Arthur Ford in the 1960s and 70s, and has since founded Delphi University with her husband. Delphi offers courses in healing, metaphysics, psychic training, transpersonal psychology, and spiritual and intuitive development. Boy, would I love to get my hands on any of her Delphi texts or materials. If anybody wants to hook me up with any of those materials, that, I'd do a cartwheel and then go to the hospital, but I'd do a cartwheel. Messages, Signs, Visits, and Premonitions from Loved Ones Lost on 9/11 by Bonnie McEneaney. If you love this podcast, you will absolutely love this book. I'm not ashamed to admit, I think I've admitted this before, that I often fall for books with great covers, and this one is beautiful. But all I needed was the title this time. And then when I saw the quote by James Van Praagh, I knew for sure that this book would be rushed to my doorstep in 2 days' time. The author, Bonnie McEneaney, lost her husband in the events of 9/11. Years later, after getting to know other folks who lost loved ones on the same day, she realized that there were so many beautiful examples and stories of loved ones leaving signs, messages, etc. I am so happy that Bonnie put the work and effort into collecting these stories for a book. Sure, you'll be touched by the feelings of great loss, but you won't be dragged through the events of the tragic day. The awesome part is that every single story, and there are so many, leaves you with the same feel-good confidence that our loved ones are still with us when they leave the physical. Here's the book description. When Bonnie McEneaney's husband, Eamon, died in the attacks on the World Trade Center, she thought she had lost him forever. And then something unexpected happened that would shake her to the core and reassure her that her husband was still with her. As Bonnie reveals in this groundbreaking book, she began to have experiences that convinced her that her husband, in spirit, was sending her signs, indeed messages, that he was still present and watching over his family. A mother and former business executive, Bonnie was always the rational one and quite skeptical of the spiritual world and all that it represents. But after talking to a number of other families and friends of loved ones lost on 9/11, she realized she was not alone. Numerous others connected to the tragedy, from financial executives to stay-at-home moms, described their own experiences, premonitions, signs, dreams, visitations, and communications through mediums and psychics. Bonnie began recording their compelling stories in a groundbreaking 4-year-long project, illuminating the power of love and the unbreakable bond love creates. Now, in Messages, she shares these miraculous spiritual stories while weaving in her own heartfelt message of comfort and hope for all those who are searching for their own deeper connections, proving that love and relationships can continue after death. Talking to the Dead, Kate and Maggie Fox and the Rise of Spiritualism by Barbara Weisberg. I think you'll learn everything you ever wanted to know about Kate and Maggie Fox with this book. If you read books on ghosts or paranormal investigation topics, you know that most of these books include a small section that usually credits these two sisters for starting the movement known as Spiritualism on accident in the late 1840s. Usually when you read this section, you get a little bit of the author's personal opinion on whether or not the Fox sisters pulled off the biggest hoax ever. Before reading this book, I knew that they admitted to being frauds, but then later recanted. But it seemed to me as if most authors that mentioned the sisters believed there was at least an element of authentic spirit communication happening. The two younger sisters, Maggie and Kate, claimed to hear rapping and knocks in their home coming from what they eventually decided was the spirit of a murdered peddler from years before. They were one of the first to attempt to communicate with spirits with this system of rapping. They eventually developed a system of yes and no answers and even spelling out messages.
People came from all over to see it, and they were an overnight sensation. Throughout this book, I kept thinking to myself, so was it real or not? Just tell me. As I read, I started out with the feeling the author was a believer in spiritualism, as she seemed to believe almost every detail. Then toward the end, I was surprised to find that she seemed to actually be very skeptical and was only telling the story from documented history, like a journalist. Strangely, though, there are a lot of holes in the records and history involving the Fox sisters. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, and it seems that some people believe that they were legit, and some people don't. I definitely learned that they had some sketchy and unclear moments. In this book, you'll read quite a bit about Maggie and Kate's parents and other siblings. Leah was a much older sister and was very influential in Maggie and Kate's futures as mediums and speakers who travel around the world demonstrating their abilities. The book doesn't always paint a nice picture of her, though, and I had never even before heard of Leah. It seems to me that she is just as important in the Fox sisters' story, so I enjoyed learning about Leah. You'll read about their loves and relationships. Maggie went through a particularly rough time with a man named Elisha Cant, I think is how you say his name, who was an explorer and who tried to change her. I despised this man more and more with every detail I learned. Among their friendships were famous and influential people who supported, followed, or were clients. There is much history of the spiritualism movement in general included in the book. These women had leadership roles and started a movement in the days that women weren't really accepted as leaders and weren't supposed to be influential and smart. There were times they were definitely in danger. These were some ballsy girls. In general, I had no idea that they were famous into adulthood and led the movement for such a long period of time. They were full-blown celebrities for a while. The book follows them till death and closes out with a summary of the spiritualism movement since then. The Patience of Pearl, Spiritualism and Authorship in the Writings of Pearl Curran by Daniel B. Shea. This is the mysterious story of the St. Louis housewife named Pearl Curran, who in 1913 began channeling entire books and other works from a spirit known as Patience Worth, and all through the Ouija board. In 2015, I produced an episode devoted to Pearl and Patience. It's episode 32, and you can get to that episode by going to bigseance.com/32. For the next 3 books, we'll need to transport ourselves over to the UK. First up, This House is Haunted, The True Story of the Enfield Poltergeist by Guy Lyon Playfair. This is the inside story of the Enfield Poltergeist. This was a case that was investigated by the author himself and another researcher named Maurice Gross, who died in 2006. And they investigated and researched the case heavily for over a year, beginning in 1977 and wrapping up around 1979. The book was published in 1980. Guy Lyon Playfair crossed over earlier this year, but I was lucky enough and honored to be given the opportunity to interview him 2 years ago in one of the most popular episodes of the Big Seance podcast, and that was episode 56. Go to bigseance.com/56 for this one, if you missed it. In that interview, we discuss his book, along with the movie Conjuring 2, which at the time had yet to be released. The Enfield Poltergeist was the subject of The Conjuring 2, but like the other films, Ed and Lorraine Warren save the day and are the main characters in the story. Mr. Playfair assured me that the Warrens had little or nothing to do with the case, which I believe can probably be said about all of the films in the Conjuring franchise. Nowhere in Mr. Playfair's book does it mention their involvement. Everything we know about the Enfield Poltergeist came from Guy's book and research, so definitely check this out.
The Most Haunted House in England by Harry Price. I very much recommend this book. It's about the Borley Rectory. I believe it's out of print, but there are usually used copies for sale online, and they've had reprints that look a little different. Some of them have different covers. It's like a lesson in taking things back to the basics in an investigation. Although Harry was pretty techie for the time period, actually. To this day, paranormal investigators are using some of the same techniques that Harry used in the 1920s and 30s. I learned a lot about investigation reports even, and data collection, and I incorporated that into the paranormal investigations that I did for several years. The Skull Experiment, Scientific Evidence for Life After Death by Grant and Jane Solomon. This is the book that chronicles and recounts the 5-year experiment of life after death and many of the simply amazing experiences that few people have ever been lucky enough to see. And it all happened in the Skull Hole, a dark cellar in a Norfolk village in England. The Skull Experiment, and I have to remember to say skull, because I think my friends in the UK hear skull when I say that, but SCOLE, the Skull Experiment Group, was started by 2 mediums who joined several other spiritual individuals in what most probably know as a spirit circle, which is also similar to a seance group. One thing I didn't know before reading this book was that the structure of the group and the experiments were pretty much organized and guided by their spirit team. The team was composed of around 6 main entities, but other spirit scientists and technicians were involved in the process. Most of their communications came by using the 2 mediums in trance, but this was not the case every time. Some of the phenomena were moving spirit lights, manifestations of hands and faces being touched, surround sound-like voices speaking in the room, levitating objects, faces, and pictures showing up on sealed photographic film, and some of the cooler experiences involved many gifts of apports, which are the manifestation of objects that seemingly come from nowhere. Most of these apports were historical in nature, and many of them were inspected and verified to be authentic. So what was the goal of this group? In his first visit, Manu, the gatekeeper and leader of the spirit team, told the Skull Group that the team of beings I represent is made up of many thousands of minds from the many other realms of existence. We will be working with your group to provide very tangible evidence of the reality of these other realms. Our plan is to pioneer important methods of communication between the dimensions using energy, rather than the more traditional methods such as ectoplasm. It might be easy to blow this group off and say that there is no way to prove any of this phenomena and the experiences were real. But there are a number of scientists, psychologists, parapsychologists, and other wise and educated professionals who were present and inspected and studied the experiments. Some of these individuals were connected with the highly critical Society for Psychical Research. Halloween, An American Holiday and American History by Leslie Pratt Bannatyne. What we know as Halloween comes from so many places, traditions, and cultures that it's very easy to get lost in it all. Just like America itself, Halloween really is a blend of it all. The earliest roots come from pagan traditions that were later changed by the Catholic Church into what we know as All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Throw in a little Guy Fawkes Day, which I'd never heard of at the time, the Celtic festival of Samhain, and the Roman festival of Pomona, and hundreds of years later, we open our doors on the evening of October 31st to hear Trick or Treat being shouted by masquerading children of all ages. Here are just some of the interesting things I learned in this book. Interested in a 9th century recipe for All Souls bread that the Roman Catholic clergy encouraged the living to offer to spirits of the dead? Well, this book has it. For a while, the holiday seemed to be more about love than anything spooky. Many early Halloween traditions included young women practicing divination of all kinds to determine their future husbands. If you'd like to try it, you can stare into a candlelit mirror at midnight on Halloween. The face of your future love will show up over your shoulder. Not creepy at all, right? This is also where bobbing for apples came from. Another tradition was for girls to hang their wet blouses to dry above them while they slept. Apparently, your future husband will visit and turn the sleeve. Good to know. Another interesting tradition, the Irish dumb supper. A young woman was supposed to see the shape and image of her future love if she cooked and served an entire meal backwards. And this is something Rosemary Ellen Guiley did in a session at the Haunted America conference this last summer. I missed it, though. Leslie includes a page out of the October 1911 issue of The Delineator, where ideas for entertaining in October are given. I loved it. And I'd love a time machine. And it's this book by Leslie with this little page out of The Delineator that has gotten me obsessed ever since with old style magazines and family and home magazines that occasionally in October or in the fall would give so many cool ideas and even sometimes photos of the Halloween decor of the time and how to plan a party and how to entertain your kids for Halloween. So very interesting. Using pumpkins as lanterns or carving pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns came from the Irish. Before they arrived to America, where large pumpkins were available, they used hollowed-out turnips. The story of Jack, which there are different versions of, is also fascinating. The Mexican Day of the Dead is something I think is fascinating, and I'd love to experience that one. I've always wanted to experience the Victorian era, too. But Halloween in those days just seems so interesting and fun. Also, one of the main reasons I like the movie Meet Me in St. Louis is the depiction of Halloween in those few scenes. There's also plenty in this book on the more familiar 20th century Halloween traditions. It isn't a new book. It was originally published in 1990, but it's a good one with lots of fun facts and history. If you want to learn about the history of many of our traditions from the season while also getting in the mood for ghosts and goblins, you should check this book out. Disconnected from Death, The Evolution of Funerary Customs and the Unmasking of Death in America by April Slaughter and Troy Taylor. This is seriously one of the best books I've read in a long time. And it's also the most recent book that I've finished. I particularly loved the mind-blowing details of the memorials and funerals for President Lincoln and the funeral train. With the recent passing of Senator John McCain and the love and appreciation the whole country has been demonstrating, and the several stops and memorials that his body would go through before making its final resting place, I felt that on a smaller scale, it was so reminiscent of what I had just read in Disconnected from Death. And this would even be an incredibly useful and practical resource for anyone planning a funeral or memorial and how to not be taken advantage of by the funeral home business. I liked it so much, I ordered the book from my mom and had it delivered. Reunions. Visionary Encounters with Departed Loved Ones by Raymond Moody. This is the book that got me fascinated by psychomantiums, which is like a hardcore version of scrying. And I nearly emptied a walk-in closet, painted it black, and started researching. I still could do it sometime, so don't dare me. Here's the description from the book. A collection of the experiences of men and women who have communicated with the dead using the easy-to-learn techniques developed by Dr. Raymond Moody. As proof of life after death, these stunning testimonials promise to launch even more research and give comfort to people around the world. Our Unseen Guest by Darby and Joan. If you are fascinated by the thought of channeling through the Ouija board, or if you thought the story of Pearl Curran channeling Patience Worth sounded interesting, you'll probably like this one too. It was actually one of you who recommended this one to me. It definitely didn't disappoint. As I was putting this episode together, I put out a call for book recommendations in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Here are some of your recommendations. Vicky Cosner says she likes it old school and recommends the author Montague Summers. I did a little research in Wikipedia, and I learned that he was an English author and clergyman who was born in 1880, died in 1948. He is known primarily for his scholarly work on the English drama of the 17th century, as well as for his idiosyncratic studies on witches, vampires, and werewolves, in all of which he professed to believe. He was responsible for the first English translation, published in 1928, of the notorious 15th century witch hunter's manual, the Malleus Maleficarum. I don't even know how to pronounce that. I've never heard of it. Sounds super cool, though. Julie Wade would like to recommend 4 books: Weird Hauntings by Joanne Austen, and 3 books by Leslie Rule: Ghosts Among Us, When the Ghost Screams, and Coast to Coast Ghosts. Denise Sia would like to recommend Black-Eyed Kids by Melissa George. Anna Frias actually recommended one of the books that I just recommended, and that is Michelle Belanger's The Ghost Hunter's Survival Guide. Paula Mitchell is recommending The Light Between Us by Laura Lynn Jackson. She's also recommending We Don't Die by Joel Martin and Patricia Romanowski, and Between Two Worlds by Tyler Henry, which I totally want to read. And Tim Prossel recommended a book by this guy named Tim Prossel. Sounds familiar. And the book is called Spectral Edition. A free plug for Tim there. We miss your voice, sir. Thank you so much for the recommendations. It was kind of fun to collect them and see them. And I hope you check some of those out too. I'll put them all in the show notes so you can see them all in one place. So those will be in bigseance.com, and you could go to bigseance.com/126 since that's this episode number. Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/bigseance. Natalie, Amy Park-Gedicke, Sonia Bondarchev. And Sonia, I promise I'm going to get a hold of you and figure out how to say your name. Jenny Becker, Bianca Roth, Kim Robb, Jim Budd, David Rubenstein, Josiel Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Peggy Hagen, Sharon Bowles, Marion Hover, Clairvoyant, Miranda, Bruce Williams, Christopher Kohler, Lana Carbon and John Lilies of Carbon Lilies, Denise Sia, Anna Frias, Norman and Linda Keller, and Karen Prine. And I have to tell you, I don't even have a category for this one. But Jeffrey Peck is such a fabulous paranerd that he's contributing $20. So, maybe I just release some balloons and light fireworks or something every time I say his name. I don't know. I'll have to come up with something. I hope you guys enjoyed this solo episode, which doesn't happen often. And if you didn't, my feelings aren't hurt, because I'll be back soon with more great guests in the future. Till then, peace.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. You can find and subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and just about anywhere podcasts are found. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to bigseance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.